So we have a lot of research on how to build trust up from nothing, right? What we don't know is, well, if you had trust and you lost it, then what, right? It's not necessarily just the reverse process. And what I'm going to show you today is a couple pieces of research that are showing us empirically that what happens is once trust is lost, it's very hard to build it back up again. And if that's the case, then it really has important implications for how we should manage and build trust over time. I'm going to talk to you briefly about two papers, and the first paper is basically going to show you that it's very difficult to move on once you break trust. You can think of it like this. Most researchers, if you think of relationships and how to manage relationships, it's a lot like going through a life cycle, right? We all know products go through life cycles, relationships go through life cycles as well. So you can imagine that in most relationships, if we think about just overall performance evaluations, in other words, how each partner views the performance or would rate the performance of their partner, what you see is that early on it's relatively low, but as the two get to know each other, they start to build trust. Then these performance evaluations will increase to a point of maturity, and then eventually, the evaluations will decline, just like a product life cycle. Well, what we found in our research is that in general, across, let's say, a 5-year span, what you will see is that relationships will develop and move through these various phases. So ideally, you're moving from exploration to build up, maturity, decline. And what we see is that 2/3 of them will move through these life cycles, and the way they move, 76% of them will move in a normal pattern, what you'd expect, exploration, build-up, maturity, decline, okay? And that's pretty predictable. And when they do that, actually, then that's a good thing, right? That we find that the overall performance evaluations will track that. But interestingly, we found that there are also relationships that will digress, or what we will call restart. In other words, they might go from a state of maturity or a state of decline, and then they will go backwards. So in other words, maybe something happens, they decide to reconfigure, maybe they have a conflict, they say, let's go back to the beginning, let's build our trust again, let's try something else. And so 12% of them will do that. Then another 12% might go from a state of maturity back to exploration. Let's start all over again. Maybe we went down the wrong path. Let's rework this. And what we see, though, when you do that empirically, is we see that you will get significantly lower performance evaluations from your partner, okay? So what that's sort of telling us is that when relationships don't develop normally, in other words, if you're trying to repair or to save or to restart relationships, that sometimes perhaps the fact that you've hit decline at some stage or whatever, just going back and restarting that process isn't necessarily a good thing. Okay, not only is it not easy, right, because you're starting from a very different place than you did at the beginning, it also has a negative impact on your evaluations of each other. So it's difficult to move on. Let me tell you about one more study. It turns out there's a huge literature in satisfaction, and you probably know this, and the idea in satisfaction is basically if you don't meet a customer's expectation, right, if you disconfirm their expectation, that has a negative effect on their evaluation of your products, right, on liking or affect or the likelihood of buying your product. And so this confirmation, so in the service quality literature, they say, well, you always have to pass and exceed those expectations. Well, what we show in this study is that it's not enough just to exceed those expectations. That if you exceed those expectations, and you can do that in both a positive or a negative way, we're going to show that either way, it's going to have a downward effect on evaluations. In this setting, what we thought about is we said, you're working with a partner, you have a partner, and the partner acts in a way that is better than expected, right? So that's a positive disconfirmation. They exceed your expectations. In this case, in this particular study, we used the idea of opportunism. So in other words, we looked at the situation where your partner is less opportunistic than you expect, okay? And we would call that a positive discrepancy. And so, again, the behavior of my partner is less opportunistic than I expected. And on the other side, the behavior of my partner is more opportunistic than I expected. So in other words, I expected that you would screw me over, and in fact you did. And so, of course, not surprisingly, my valuations go down. The positive discrepancy is a little harder to get your head around. I kind of liken it to my husband and flowers. So, the thing is that my husband hates to give me flowers, okay? Because he says flowers die after 2 or 3 days and it's a waste of money. Well, of course, I love flowers, right? Because even if it's only for a few days, it brightens up my corner of the world, and to me, it's worth money. And all of a sudden, this past Valentine's Day, I get flowers, right? Now that is a huge positive discrepancy, right? It's a huge disconfirmation of my expectations. What it should do, what it should have, or the effect that it should have, is that I should just, be wild about this man. But instead, what happens? Instead, I'm suspicious, right? And all of a sudden, that positive action, right, actually makes us worse off, or it makes me worse off than it was before, okay? So in other words, the idea is like the positive discrepancy, when it's too big, is almost too good to be true, and can have an overall net effect of bringing down the evaluations, right? And that's kind of what this is showing. If you look at the curve on the side of the positive discrepancy, what you see is that this curve, the slope, drops drastically, right, compared to the negative discrepancy side. This means that the more positive the discrepancy, the bigger that bushel of flowers that my husband gives me, the faster my evaluations drop, right? And in the other direction, if you look at the negative discrepancy, the more opportunistic a partner is to me, the more they lie and cheat and steal me, well, yeah, evaluations drop, but it's sort of it's in a flatter way. In other words, at a slower rate. So why is this important? This matters because what it's saying, if you look at this closely, the circled area in red is basically showing you the only area in which any kind of positive discrepancy has a positive slope, right? And if you notice, that's really just a small area compared to the range of the whole axis. So what this is telling us then is that if you're going to build trust by doing positive things, by exceeding those expectations in a positive way, it can't be too positive. In fact, too positive actually hurts you. It has to be kind of small, consistent, positive steps over time. Okay, so here's the food for thought, and here's sort of the takeaway of all of this. What this means is that if we have lost trust and we now try to build it, it means that trust is rebuilt in very small, consistent moves over time, okay? Don't come in with a bushel of flowers and the big band, all right? That is gonna just scare the partner away. Instead, it's small, little trust, little steps over time. Maybe it means doing things unexpected, like filling the gas tank of my car when I didn't expect it, right? Having dinner ready when I come home. So those smaller steps, but happening consistently over time, will do more to raise my evaluations than the big occasional bushel of flowers. The other thing I would also tell you is, partnerships are not necessarily marriage, right? These are not vows for life. So don't be afraid to change your partners out. I just ran the simulation with my MBA class, and the whole class, for some reason, I don't know why, but everybody wanted to single source their goods. Well, what we've learned from then is that, you actually have to change your partner. Don't be afraid to change your partner. And we found that teams that did change their partner after like one round of transgressions were able to recover and to do well as well. So I would say the same thing. We use a lot of personal relationship metaphors. We like to use the marriage metaphor. I actually think the marriage metaphor is a very bad thing to use because people think that divorce is bad, right? But in business, it's not, divorce doesn't have to be ugly. It just means you just move on. If it's very hard to rebuild and to restore our relationships, then maybe, and it's possible to change partners, but maybe we should even think more broadly, which is like, think about the fact that in this day and age and in this technological age, there's all sorts of disruptions and upheavals happening in terms of firms. And so, for instance, nowadays, You can, firms are being made just through an app, right? Anybody who can put together an app. So if you can get the engineering to put together an app, you can serve up all sorts of important functions, service functions, channel flow functions to customers that are useful. And so what that means, though, is it means that the very unit of analysis of a partner, right, doesn't have to be this big, ginormous organization, right? It can be a very small organization. It can be a very focused organization. And maybe those sorts of partnerships, right, or those sorts of partners around simple functions. Maybe it's just physical possession. Maybe it's just collecting payments. Whatever it is, those sorts of partnerships are all possible too. So if you think about changing your partner, you can throw in those possibilities as well.